This is a bittersweet day for me as a proud Brit and a proud European to be my last visit to Brussels, to continental Europe, while a member of the European community. I'm really sad about that. We have lost that argument. I hope that we in the UK, the scientific community in the UK, continue to work with our friends in continental Europe. We are where we are. We have to go forward. So, as I say, it's a sad day for me. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to talk about three different things. First of all, very briefly, because I think Nick did a great job along this morning, I'm going to be talking about some of the food system challenges. Then I want to talk about a specific bit of work that we've done in Oxford, part of the modelling that underlay the Eat Lancet report just over a year ago. And then I'm going to finish with some comments about alternative proteins, some of which I'll gloss over quite quickly because I think they've been really well discussed in the panel that we've just had now, and then come to some conclusions. So, as Jackie said, my disciplinary background is as a population biologist interested in population dynamics. And the founder of my field, and coincidentally one of the sort of three classic founders of the field of economics, was Malthus, Thomas Malthus, who was a cleric working at the end of the 18th century. And Malthus famously, in his essays of population, predicted mass starvation throughout Europe in the middle of the 19th century on the grounds that population growth was geometric, 2, 4, 8, 16, whereas our ability to feed the population increased arithmetically, was limited by the land. Now, that did not happen. We did not have major systemic famines in the 20th century, although I see my colleagues from Ireland here, and of course, we had awful famines in Ireland, but they were essentially political famines. Due to mismanagement from my country, they were not due to our inability, at least potentially, to feed Europe. And the reason why Malthus' first wave, or what I've called Malthusian pessimism, did not happen was because of the Industrial Revolution and the complicated technological, economic, sociological factors that brought in. Now, I'm just old enough to remember what I think was the second sort of wave of Malthusian pessimism in the 16 and 70s, associated with writers such as Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb, The Club of Rome. And I reread Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb quite recently, and he was predicting famines in the rich world by the end of the 20th century, things that did not happen. And of course, the reason why they did not happen was the Green Revolution, was the astounding advances in plant breeding and associated technologies that happened in the 70s and 80s. And I think at the moment we're going through a third wave of Malthusian pessimism that was really triggered by the food price increases of 2008, 2010. And I think the issue is this another false alarm, or is this something that we really have to think about? So what underlies this third wave of Malthusian pessimism, one of which, of course, is population growth. So populations are continuing to grow, but global population growth is beginning to decelerate. And most estimates suggest that population will asymptote, will plateau this century. I like to tell my students at age 60, I am more optimistic about the future than I am when I was their age. And that's largely, and this reflects my disciplinary background, because of the demographic transition. Because if we bring people out of poverty, if we educate their children, especially girls, if we provide access to reproductive health care, population growth rate does decelerate. That is a get-out-of-jail card that we just did not know about 30 or 40 years ago. But of course, as people come out of poverty, which is just a good thing, they demand a more varied resource, and they demand a more varied diet, and they demand food types that take greater resources to produce. And of course, meat and dairy is one of them. And the figure on the board at the moment shows recent increases in meat consumption in different continents, and the inset graph is projections through to the middle of the century. So business as usual, there's going to be a dramatic increase in demand for food, which will be over proportional to the number of people because it will be richer people demanding the types of food that take more resources to produce. And so those are demand side challenges, and also there will be a variety of supply side challenges as well. And I suspect you're very familiar with these issues. So without going into any great detail of the food challenges ahead, we'll see continuing demand growth, which is complicated by trends such as urbanization and megacities. We will continue to see hunger, although we should not underestimate the enormous progress that has been made on hunger in the last 50 years. And then we have the epidemic of obesity, something that just was not appreciated that this would happen 50 years ago. We see pressures on agriculture, water scarcity, competition for land and soil, all the things you know very well. And we are entering a period of greater probabilities of risks, both probability of political risks, you can see the issues around trade negotiations at the moment, and biophysical risk. And those poor cows bottom right are victims of the terrible fires that we've seen in Australia over the last couple of months. So I think that we are entering a period of concern about the food system, an area of potential disruption in the way we think about the food system. So the second thing I want to do is to describe some work we've done at Oxford as part of a series of modelling studies we've done. And I'm just going to describe one, and I'm going to describe it really quite fast, and forgive me for not giving details, and do feel free to come and ask me a question or catch me in the reception afterwards if you'd like more details. So what I want to do is to ask rhetorically, can we feed the world within planetary boundaries? And I'll explain what planetary boundaries are. And this was some modelling that we were asked to do by the group that went on to form the Lancet Commission and the Eat Lancet recommendations. One of the things we were asked particularly to is what particular types of food have the greatest effects on the different planetary boundaries, and what sets of solutions might exist out there. Now, for those of you who, the person who led this work is a tremendously talented postdoc working in Oxford called Marco Springman, and that is a box that shows some of the modelling components. And again, forgive me, I'm going to skip over this to keep to time, but I'm very happy to answer questions. So for those of you who don't know planetary boundaries, they have been set up and argued for a number of people, and Johan Rockström, who's in the bottom right there, is perhaps the leader of this group. And Rockström has asked, well, what are the boundaries that we must remain within to have a sustainable Earth system going ahead? And you can do this in different ways, but the typical way that this is looked at is to say, well, there are issues such as ocean stratification, ocean acidification, stratospheric ozone depletion, etc., etc. And there are a number which are particularly associated with agriculture, and I realize it's quite light here, so I'll read them out. The one at the top right is climate change. Then we have, going around climate change, nitrogen pollution in the environment, phosphorus pollution in the environment, global freshwater use, and change in land use, so using land use. So the argument is that in all these different dimensions, we are pushing towards boundaries which, if we exceed, we're undermining our capacity for a sustainable future. And Rockström's group estimate that for climate change, where it's going red, we're already exceeding that, or nearly exceeding that. Ocean acidification, we're not there yet. And then if you go around nitrogen, we're way above it. Phosphorus, not yet. Water, not yet. Change in land use, not yet. And the last one is biodiversity loss. So I'm going to focus on these five. You could also argue that agriculture has effects on biodiversity loss. Now, you can criticize the whole conception of planetary boundaries. I mean, there definitely isn't a sort of straight threshold beyond which lack of sustainability occurs. But I think it's a very good construct to focus our minds on what we have to do to get a sustainable environment. And it's very good for communicating with broader audiences. So as I said, what we've tried to do, led by Marco, is to look at the contribution of food production to moving towards these different boundaries, and then within that to look at the different types of food that contribute to it. So let me give you an example of how we went about it, and this is for one particular planetary boundary, and it's the one for greenhouse gas emissions. And what we've done is we've scaled the contribution of the food system to greenhouse gas emissions as 100 now, and then we've divided it up into the different components. And you'll see that for this particular planetary boundary, then it's the livestock sector that makes the greatest contribution, so animal products, and then followed by staple crops. And then if you look at the other ones, legumes, nuts and seeds, fruits and vegetables, oils, sugars, and a category of other crops has less of an effect. So for this particular planetary boundaries, then we have to care about livestock. So there on the y-axis on the left are the 5 planetary boundaries we've looked at, and that's just the figure I showed you in greater detail on the previous slide. And let me fill in now the other ones, and then going from the top, it's cropland use, freshwater, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And you can see that these are really quite similar. And there it's the yellow bar. That's the sort of staple crops that has the greatest effect. So again, what it's trying to do is to decompose the effects of different food types and the potential of crossing planetary boundaries. Now that's for now, and again, keeping the scaling the same, we can use some economic modeling driven by trends in increases in crop productivity, trends in consumer demand, to say business as usual, what will it look like by the middle of century? So I've just put them in there. And you can see that all the contributions to these boundaries continue, business as usual. Disproportionately, the effect of the livestock and meat sector on greenhouse gas emissions increases through to mid-century. And again, this is largely caused by people coming out of poverty and demanding a richer diet, a diet richer in animal products. Okay, so that's an attempt to diagnose some of the issues going ahead. What you can also do, or what we also tried to do, was to look at the contributions to rowing back the effects of the food system on the planetary boundaries. What can we do? How can we project a trajectory in which the food system has much less effects on these environmental issues? And what we did was we looked at 4 components, one of which I'm not going to talk about, the socioeconomic, as it's quite small, but 4 components which we think are the way to make the greatest difference. So at the top, it's called FLEX there for flexitarian, but actually it's a code for dietary change. The tech bit, the gray bar there, is what we can do if we can invest in put more investment into agricultural research. Again, there's some really excellent econometric studies which look at the returns of investment in agricultural research, both in terms of yields and in terms of environmental performance. And then finally, the last one is waste. And again, if we look for that particular one for greenhouse gas emissions, if we are really serious about the food sector contributing to a net zero world by mid-century, then dietary change is going to be really, really important. There's a role for technology, and Ricardo talked about some of the really exciting things that can be done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, for example, from ruminants. But in this particular case, we think that dietary change, and this very much relates to some of the goals of the Protein2Food program, is really important there. I'm now just going to put up the other ones. And yes, dietary change is important to helping the food system use less land, use less water, pollute less with nitrogen and phosphorus. But there we see a real role for increased investment in technology. And I haven't talked about waste, but waste all the way along can be very valuable and can be very helpful in helping us keep within planetary boundaries. So in the third and final part of the talk, I want to discuss some of the issues around meat alternatives, and this is slightly based and updated on some work we did from the World Economic Forum, a paper on alternative proteins that came out, not this Davos, but the one before. And we looked at a variety of different alternative proteins from some of the plant-based burgers that we've been talking about now, through things such as mycoprotein, Quorn, the British firm that has done that. I'm a population biologist, so all my experimental work has been on insects. And so I'm always interested when there's insect things there. Reflecting some of the issues about taste, I don't think I've yet to have an insect that hasn't tasted better than the sauce in which it's been cooked. But I live and hope for some really tasty insect food. And then some of the still at early stages of development, the cellular clean meat looking ahead. So I want to say a few things about environment, about health, and then about some of the socioeconomics around the transition to alternative proteins. Now, this is a little bit out of date now, and we're collecting new data at the moment, and I know that people here have been talking about new data, but this was our estimate of emissions intensity just using CO2 equivalents for both meat produced in different ways, and I do realize that even within a category such as beef, there are a multitude of different ways of producing beef, but that's an average, a weighted average of how beef is produced at the moment, all the way through to alternative proteins based on plants. And I'll make 2 points about this. And again, you can argue about the specific figures, but I think there are 2 broad plants. First, 2 broad points. First, as you move from real meat through to cultured meat, through to mycoproteins, insects to plants, you're getting dramatically improved reductions in emissions. So again, if one really cares about emissions, if one believes, as I do, about the real existential challenge about getting to net zero within, by mid-century, by around mid-century, one has to think really seriously about this. Now, a famous company executive sort of phoned me up and yelled at me about the cultured beef estimation there. And it is a bit unfair because that's our best guess at the moment. Depends on your time scale. Reducing methane would be critical to reducing targets in the next decade, but it'd be really, really silly to trade off methane against carbon dioxide. So one has to take that quite subtly. And I think, and I'm not going to talk about this in any detail, this is some work from John Lynch and Ray Peer-Humbert at Oxford. You can have some cultured meat that actually, when you look at greenhouse gas equivalents, appears better, but actually it isn't, because although it produces less CO2, because CO2 accumulates, the effect continues for longer. And again, the time scale there is sort of ridiculously long, 1,000 years. But it just shows that one has to look very carefully, I think, at specific greenhouse gas emissions. So as a comment on environment, this is the Global Burden of Disease study, the major study that is trying to look at the effects of diet on health. And I've highlighted there the sort of effects of animal source foods. Now here, diets high in processed meat, low in milk, high in red meats, they really come down quite low here. So compared with the advantages of eating more whole grains, the advantages of eating nuts and seeds, the disadvantages of eating diets low in vegetables, then differences around meat and dairy are relatively small. But I would point out that high sodium, diets high in sodium, are really, really damaging. And in fact, when we compare, say, plant-based versus animal-based foods, and I have seen things in the literature saying that plant-based foods are much worse because, as I think it was Pablo said, they tend to be highly processed. They tend to have the salt put in. So if you compare that with a pate, they appear worse. But actually, that's normally how we eat are hamburgers with lots of other things in it. So it's really important when one's thinking about health to think about the health effects of meals, not of particular food types. And it's really complex. But Pablo sort of did my job for me in talking about the complexities of nutrition and the amount of bad studies out there. And we struggle with this. In Oxford, we have a group that has access to some wonderful data sets. This is the European EPIC cohort, 400,000 people. This is being published this week, so I thought I'd just show it to you. And it's the effects of a whole load of foods on the two types of stroke, the hemorrhagic stroke on the bottom and the ischemic stroke there. And the result, and with all the caveats that Pablo mentioned, that I would just really reinforce, it seems milk, yogurt, cheese are protective for ischemic stroke, although vegetables and fiber even more, whereas eggs tend to give a higher risk of the other stroke. Now, the odds ratios here are not very great. It is small compared with overall mortality of other effects, but again, they're really subtle. And then the final point on health I was going to make, which Pablo has made beforehand, the vast, vast majority of people in developed countries are not short of protein. And the fetishism of protein in marketing has been a real strand over the last 10 years or so, and I think it's misleading. And in no way do I want to, I think it's Ricardo who made the point that there are some sectors of the community who are protein stressed, but the vast, vast majority are not. Right, just coming to an end, I'm going to go over this very quickly. We've done some sociological research about which of the narratives that are most supporting alternative proteins, and it seems to be, at least within the UK populations we've looked at and researched on the web, is animal products do not harm animals. Seems to be the thing that's pushing it, at least at the moment. And if you look at the counter-narratives, who's arguing against it, then it seems to be the fact that they are not real foods. And it's curious that there is, within the millennial generation, there is a concern about the environment and there's concern about animal welfare going for alternative proteins, and then the concern about authenticity that is going in the opposite things. And if I had another 5 minutes, which I don't, I'd talk in depth.
Take a couple of minutes. We're okay for a couple of minutes, please.
Careful what you allow. I would like to say that going ahead and really looking at some of these major environmental and sociological problems that we have, the importance of getting a narrative that brings the farmer community along with us, that engages with the farming community so that they're seen as part of the solution and not the enemy out there, I think is just so critical. And if you look at what's happened in my country with Brexit, with Trump, with Modi, with the Gilets jaunes, with farmer disturbances in the Netherlands, if we get it wrong, if we get the narrative wrong, if we forget that in raising all boats, some sectors lose out very badly, if we forget them, if we forget those who are left behind, we can sort of give up on trying to approach these bigger problems. So that's my final slide, and forgive me, Jackie, for going over 2 minutes. So you'll recall I had a question mark at the end. Is there a solution to this third wave of Malthusian pessimism? And as I said, I really am an optimist. I think we need a green revolution, but what my colleague Gordon Conway calls a double green revolution. So a green revolution that has the yield effects that the last green revolution had, but in addition is equally revolutionary when it comes to resource efficiency and resource use. And I think we need a revolution on the consumption side as well, a revolution in the way we think and what we eat. And that has to be done within the framework of a narrative where we as a society can go forward together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Charles. Thank you. Very interesting there among the many fascinating points you made. That point we tended, when we talk about narratives, to focus very much on narratives to consumers. and we didn't talk so much about the narrative about farmers. So I thought that was a very interesting point, and lots of fascinating things. We don't have very long, but are there any burning questions for Charles based on that very rich presentation? Anybody want to? Was indeed very comprehensive, so it may be that all your questions have been answered, but please.
Yet again, Milka Sokolovic from UFIC. I'm really happy that you made a link between sustainable diets and nutrition and health. So I know that you're a population biologist as your background, but what would be your main concerns when it comes to nutrition if one would follow, or if a population would follow a more like planetary, healthy or sustainable diet? What would be the major health concerns or nutrition concerns?
So let me talk about the rich world. I think there's some real issues in the developing world where people, at least for the foreseeable future, pastoralist communities and for example, animal food is really, really critical there. I think that with the exception of some minor groups, there is no real health issue for that. So to me, the big issues around moving to a plant-based diet are environmental, they're structural, socioeconomic structural within the industry. And I think there are some small issues around human nutrition. I think it's a really interesting question, and Jackie said not to go there rightly, but how many of the problems of nutrition should lie within the food system and how much should lie outside? Now, I'm happy to argue the point. I don't think that universal basic income is the solution, but I sure as hell think we need some solutions to address the second of the major challenges of the 21st century, climate change and increasing inequality.
Thank you. Any other questions to Charles? Or indeed, as I say, very welcome to make a comment to what you have heard. Udo. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I had one question on, because you were having one of your diagrams that you showed the effect on 2010 versus 2050 and the contribution of the different sectors on greenhouse gas emissions, but also the use of cropland. And I was a bit surprised to see that, for instance, the use for cropland, the contribution of animal products was relatively small, whereas the general opinion on that is that animal products themselves don't use so much because they only use the meadows where they're roaming around, but they use a lot of external hectares for their feed. Is that included in the red bar?
It is included. It includes the all the feed that comes through, and you're right, it's less than most people think. The reason why it was less, and we may be wrong, I mean, the reason for doing these models is to try and work out what your thinking is. But the model has an explicit economics in it, and it talks about the increase in the cost of land conversion and things. So the economic feedback slows the change in land conversion.
Thank you very much. Any last burning points? Take one more and then we need to move on. Don't want to keep you from your drinks at the end of the day. Thank you.
Mariette van der Noord, a freelance food scientist. Did I understand correctly that you stress that youngsters are very environmental concerned, but that they don't easily accept the new or plant-based protein products? Did I understand that correctly?
So what we found, and this surprised me, is that the main driver for vegetarianism and veganism in the UK among youngsters is not the environment, which is what I thought and which is why I'm a flexitarian. It is concern about animals and concern about animal welfare. Now, that was our study. I know there have been some other studies which have found that environment to be more important. But we found that the issues around animal welfare to be the biggest driver. And then we also found that, that especially millennials care about food authenticity, and it sort of rubs up against each other. And again, Pablo mentioned some of the issues around ultra-processed foods, and the wrongly, in my view, equation of ultra-processed with always bad. And I think you can have very, very many different types of processed foods. So it's an interesting contradiction that is not always worked out in the minds of individuals, let alone in society.
And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking Charles very much indeed? That was terrific stuff, Charles, and